Welcome. This lecture covers applications of Pavlovian conditioning. In particular, we will discuss conditioned emotions, exposure therapies, taste aversion, prejudice, and advertising. First, a little bit of background. Nowadays, we understand that nature and nurture work together to determine why we do the things that we do. But that wasn't always the case. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was the eugenics movement, and it was a very popular movement, even here in the United States. The ideas that it pushed was that behavior was a product of heredity, or of our genes. And these ideas supported classism, racism, segregation, marital prohibitions, and even forced sterilizations. In the heyday of all of this, there was John B. Watson. And although Watson's work is now considered unethical, at the time it was actually very forward-looking, because Watson argued that any healthy infant, regardless of race, regardless of their ancestry, could become a doctor, lawyer, or really any specialty. And so the Little Albert study, which nowadays is discussed as being very unethical, but at the time it was really a test of this idea. And so what the goal of it was to demonstrate that even just basic fears are learned. They're not innate. And in doing so, revealing that our behaviors are a product of our environment, not of our genes. So you can click on the video and watch the video. If the video doesn't work for you, there are links to YouTube that should work. Take a moment to watch those before continuing the lecture. What did Watson do? In Pavlovian conditioning terms, what was the neutral stimulus, what was the unconditioned stimulus, and what was the unconditioned response? The neutral stimulus was the white rat, right? He presented the white rat to little Albert and then followed that with a loud noise, the only thing that he found that scared little Albert. The result of the loud noise was a fear response in little Albert. By pairing the two stimuli, the white rat with the loud noise, eventually the presentation of the white rat produced the fear response in little Albert. So Watson referred to this as a conditioned emotional response. Conditional emotional responses are emotions that are aroused by stimuli that have been paired with an unconditioned stimulus that produces that response. And what he argued and has been demonstrated is that this doesn't apply only to fear, but really to any emotional response. Any emotional response can be conditioned. So as we go through the rest of this lecture, we will see how these emotional responses have been, can be, and are conditioned in a variety of situations. If an emotional response can be conditioned, then that suggests that they should also be able to be unconditioned, right? So Mary Cover Jones, who worked with John Watson, developed the technique that she called counter-conditioning. She worked with a child, Peter, so this is not little Albert, a different child, who had what she called a homegrown fear of rabbits, rats, fur coats, feathers, anything kind of fluffy, furry. In other words, this is a child who already had this fear. This was not one that they conditioned in the child like they did with little Albert. This is a child that they recruited who was already afraid of these things. What Mary Cover Jones did was the child exhibited a fear of a rabbit, and so she had a rabbit in a cage, a long ways away from Peter, far enough away that it didn't scare him. He was okay with it being present. And they gave him crackers and milk for him to partake. And while he was eating his crackers and drinking his milk, she moved the rabbit a little bit closer to him and a little bit closer to him, let the rabbit out of its cage, and moving it, though, in such a way that it didn't disrupt him. He stayed calm through the whole thing. And before long, he was eating crackers and petting the rabbit and exhibiting no signs of fear. So this approach is now referred to as exposure therapy, and is a very powerful technique used for treating a lot of things. Exposure therapy, then, is any of several forms of counter-conditioning in which a person is exposed to a stimulus. The examples we'll look at here deal with phobia treatment. So this is the gold standard, and what that means is that any new treatment that comes out is compared to exposure therapy to see whether it works as well. So the first of these is systematic desensitization. This is very similar to what Mary Cover-Jones did. The idea behind, or the approach of systematic desensitization, is to expose the person to progressively stronger forms of the feared stimulus while attempting to keep the person in a relaxed state. So the video on the right, the child social phobia treatment video, is a demonstration of that. Flooding is a different technique. This is also in exposure therapy, but in this case, the person is confronted with the strongest form of the feared stimulus. And the idea behind it is to actually induce panic, induce a panic attack, but keep them in the presence of the fear stimulus until the fear goes away. Essentially, one can't stay in a panic state forever. They will eventually get tired, and the panic state will pass. And so the goal of flooding is to keep them in the presence of the fear stimulus until they're essentially exhausted and the fear goes away. At which point, then the conditioned response can be extinguished. So it's presenting the CS repeatedly or continuously until that fear response, the conditioned response, is exhausted. You can also watch a video on that. You can pause the lecture and watch those videos. Now, how have these conditioning techniques been applied and help us understand other things? So paraphilias. Paraphilias, it just means incorrect love. Now, historically, there have been a lot of ideas about where these paraphilias come from. According to Freud, they were due to unconscious forces. So exhibitionism, that's sexual gratification by exposing your genitals. Freud's idea was that mothers rejected the boy because their genitals were different from the mother's, and so they, as adults, then flash women. They force women to see their genitals as a way of gaining acceptance. Clearly not a very scientific explanation there. Masochism is sexual gratification from pain and humiliation. It would seem to be something that is maybe beyond a scientific investigation. According to Freud, it was the result of a death drive and the guilt of the Oedipal urge. So, again, not a very scientific approach from Freud. So, are these behaviors beyond scientific analysis? Well, let's take the case of masochism. Could that be something that is learned? Pavlov himself investigated this, somewhat unintentionally, but it is applied. Rather than present a bell or a tone or a metronome before feeding his dog, he shocked the dog. So he provided an electric shock and then gave food, and then of course the food elicited salivation. Keep in mind though, the shock is an aversive stimulus, so the dog reacted to the shock, but then got fed, and then salivated. And by repeating that, before long, when the shock was presented, the dog would begin salivating. And not only that, but any notion of the shock being aversive went away. In other words, the dog's heart rate didn't go up. It showed no pain response from the shock. Instead, the shock just became a predictor of food, and the dog reacted to the shock in a way of then anticipating food. This suggests that maybe some of these things, these behaviors, this gratification from pain, could come from one's experiences, from one's background. Aversion therapy is another type of counter-conditioning. In this case, though, the goal is to train a negative emotional response to a stimulus that is previously producing a positive or emotional response or sexual arousal. So the procedure would go like this. You have a conditioned stimulus, images of or activities that are deemed to be socially unacceptable that in this person produce sexual arousal. So those images are, instead of being paired with sexual arousal, they are paired with an emetic, a drug that induces nausea and vomiting. So we take the pictures, the client sees the picture and then is made sick. And by continuing to pair images with being sick, eventually those images will produce the nausea and vomiting on their own. There are, of course, some ethical concerns with this approach. One, should therapists be doing this to their clients? Should therapists be making their clients feel pain or feel sick and vomit? Is that really the thing that therapists should be doing, as opposed to instead training positive emotions? The other, perhaps bigger ethical concern here is, who decides what is inappropriate? Societally, things have changed a lot. Before 1967, interracial marriage was banned. So anyone who had interest in having a relationship with somebody who was a different color would have been a candidate for this kind of therapy. Before 1973, homosexuality was classified as a mental disorder in the DSM, in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. Now, of course, it is not. But here on the right-hand side, the image is showing a visually keyed shocker. This was from early 1970s, and this is an automated conditioning device, as you can see there, for addiction, masochism, alcoholism, aggression, and so on. And the way this worked was to present pictures of, like in this case, alcohol, and when the client saw the picture, they would then get shocked. And there were other pictures in there that were not of things like that, and so they didn't get shocked on those pictures. But anytime, with alcoholism, anytime a picture of alcohol or someone drinking alcohol came up, then the client would get shocked. This is not a therapy that's used a lot now, but it is still used in pockets, and it is of concern because it is a powerful approach, but it's not without its side effects. And it still comes back to that question of who's deciding what behavior and what reactions are appropriate and inappropriate. conditioned taste aversion. Have you ever eaten something and then, or drank something and then gotten really sick afterwards? Throwing up kind of sick. And even though you know that the food or the drink wasn't the cause of getting sick, does that food, like even thinking about it, still make you ill? If so, then that's a pretty common thing. Most people have at least one thing that they have a taste aversion for. How does this work? Well, John Garcia conducted the initial research on this. First, he gave rats bottles of water and sweetened water, and found that rats, like people, prefer sweetened water. So 88% of their total intake was from the sweetened water. Then, on another day, he gave rats the sweetened water to drink. So they only got that water to drink. And then he put them into a chamber with radiation. Radiation causes nausea, and if rats could vomit, then they would vomit. But he gave them enough radiation that it would make them sick. He then waited for 3 days and gave the rats the choice between regular water and sweetened water. Now, the rats that didn't get exposure to radiation continued to like the sweetened water. So you can see that there's still the radiation exposure group none. They still preferred the sweetened water. 88% of their intake was still from the sweetened water. But those that had mild exposure to radiation following drinking the sweetened water before, we see that their preference shifted, and that they only about 33% of their intake was of the sweetened water. The rest of the water they drank was the unsweetened, the regular water. And those that were exposed to high levels of radiation didn't drink hardly any sweetened water at all. The one-time exposure to being sick after drinking the sweetened water was enough to change their preference from sweetened water to regular water. In other words, the sweetened water made them sick. So this is different from typical conditioning because the CS in the US, right, the flavor and the getting sick only had to happen one time. And it completely changed the way the rats changed their behavior. What Garcia also found is that the interval, the time between the CS and the US, could be much longer than just the 30-minute interval. 30 minutes was already a long time, but they tested up to several hours and found that even if they drink the sweetened water and then 4 hours later they're exposed to radiation, that one-time exposure would still be enough to change their preference. Now, why might these differences be for taste? Why might it be that it only takes one time of tasting something and then getting sick to change our preference for things? Something else that Pavlovian conditioning can help us understand is drug overdose deaths. As you can see in the graphic, the number of drug overdose deaths has increased dramatically over the last decade. This, of course, is an important issue and one that needs to be looked at. In many of these cases, though, the victim only took a routine dosage of the drug. In other words, they took the same amount that they've been taking. It shouldn't have been a lethal dose, and yet they died. Why might this routine dosage kill them? What we know is that drug tolerance involves, of course, the biological reaction. So there are biological changes to how the body responds to a drug. But there are other components too. So part of that biological reaction is that, for example, with morphine, what morphine does is it produces a decrease in heart rate and respiration. Our body naturally compensates for that by trying to increase the heart rate, right? So the morphine is a challenge to the body, and the body's natural compensatory response is to try to counteract that and increase the heart rate. Over time, if someone takes a drug in the same context or a similar context, then that context can become a conditioned stimulus. In other words, when they're in that context, their heart rate will go up and their respiration will increase. Now, the drug user, when they are in that context, what they will feel as their heart rate starts to go up, as they start to breathe faster, they will feel like they need the drug, right? They will feel that as cravings, that whenever they're in that situation, they feel cravings for the drug. But what that is their body preparing for the upcoming challenge. So their heart rate increases in preparation for what the drug is going to do to them, which is decrease their heart rate. So this is known as a compensatory preparatory response theory. So the idea that CSs, that conditioned responses, prepare us for the upcoming unconditioned stimulus. And so what this leads to, though, is contextual tolerance, right? Within that setting, within that context, a drug user has tolerance to a particular level of the drug. But if they take that same drug outside of the familiar context, then they don't have that tolerance, and the drug use, that same dosage, could result in death. In this experiment that we'll walk through, we'll see exactly how that works. Right? So Shepard Siegel, back in 1982, conducted this experiment using 3 different groups of rats. One group, the control group, was a group of naive rats. They were never given heroin. So these are they're clean rats, naive rats. Another group received heroin. They were injected in room A. So that's where they always received it. Anytime when they were going to get their dose of heroin each day, they got it in room A. The third group received their heroin in room B. So we have one group of rats that's never had heroin and 2 groups of rats that have had heroin, one in room A, one in room B. And these rooms were made to look very different from each other. Then he gave all of the rats a lethal dose, right? So it was twice as much as what the rats were getting, the ones that were getting it. It was twice as much as what they had been getting. And the question was, we give them this lethal dose, how many of them survive? So what we're looking at on the graph then is the percentage of rats in each group that survived the lethal dose. So first we'll look at the naive rats, so those that had never had heroin before. And we see that not very many, 4%, survived. So that tells us that yes, this was a lethal dose of heroin, because it killed almost all of the rats in that group. So what about how many survived if they had received their regular dosage in room A, but then they received the lethal dose in room B? This is going to test the just tolerance based on exposure to heroin alone, right? And what we see is that, well, around 36-37% of those rats survived the lethal dose. So exposure to heroin in any context helped these rats survive a lethal dose. However, rats that were given the lethal dose in the same room, in the same context in which they had been taking heroin anyway, 70% of them survived. What this shows us then is that there is both a physiological tolerance, so exposure to the drug produces tolerance, which we know and understand, but that the context, the environment in which one takes the drug, is also really important. Taking the drug, even a routine dosage, in a new environment can be lethal. And mistakenly taking a higher dose than normal, but if it's in the same familiar environment, then one is more likely to survive. Let's look at something else now. Let's start getting into things that are these more broad, applicable things. Keep in mind what we're talking about here are conditioned emotional responses through Pavlovian conditioning. So let's talk about prejudice. Prejudice is defined as a preconceived opinion that is not based on reason or actual experience. What it comes right down to, those is, and we know this through various studies, is that prejudice has a very strong emotional component to it. It's not a rational thought. Instead, it's more of a gut reaction to things or people. So where does that emotion come from? Can we have emotional responses just by having words, descriptions, paired with a group of people? So Stats conducted this experiment in which they showed participants nationalities, so names of nationalities. They saw the nationality, and while they were seeing the name of the nationality, they heard the experimenter say a word, and the participants were instructed to repeat the word that they heard the experimenter say. So many of the words that the experimenter said were emotionally neutral words, but some of them were positive words, such as gift, sacred, and happy. And so when the word Dutch was on the screen, the experimenter would say gift, the participant would also say gift, and then they would move on to another nationality on the screen, and then hear another word, and then you go through that for a little bit, and then we get back, and Dutch would show up on the screen, and the experimenter would say happy, and the participant would say happy, and so on. There were also negative words, and so when Swedish showed on the screen, then the experimenter said bitter, and the participant was to repeat bitter. All right. After going through all of this, and so they saw each one of these nationalities several times, and each time they saw the nationality, they heard and repeated a different word. But whenever they saw Dutch, they heard and repeated positive words, and whenever they saw Swedish, they heard and repeated negative emotional words. So what effect did this have? At the end, they filled out a negativity rating scale for each of the nationalities. So the more negative they felt about that nationality, the higher the score. And they found that those who had Dutch paired with positive words had a lower negativity rating of the Dutch than those that had Swedish paired with the negative words. They rated them as more negative. And just to be sure that they didn't come into the experiment with any preconceived or initial feelings about Dutch or Swedish, they also switched the pairing. And so for group 2, we see that those who had Dutch paired with negative words rated them as more negative, and then Swedish who were paired with positive words. So what this tells us is that just through simple word pairings, that can affect how we feel about groups of people. So take a minute and think about different groups of people and the kinds of descriptions that we tend to hear that go along with them. The words that get used with these groups of people to describe them. Is it that those words are used because we're prejudiced? Or is it the use of those words that makes us prejudice? What about advertising? Now, we know that conditioning is used in advertising. It's used a lot. And of course it is, because it's powerful. We have a product that gets paired with a celebrity, right? Someone that people have good opinions of, and that produces positive emotions, or a product gets paired with funny scenes or with a sexy model, right? It's all about product placement, product pairing products with stuff that makes us then, as consumers, feel good about that product. As you might imagine, a lot of research has gone into this. Here's just one example. So, Stewart, 1987. This is known as the Brandel toothpaste study. It's a relatively simple experiment. There are two groups of people. The control group saw Brandel toothpaste. So this is just toothpaste that has it's a picture of a tube of toothpaste that says Brandel on it. And they saw the picture of the toothpaste, and then they saw a picture of neutral stimuli. So neutral emotional stimuli like a satellite dish or a license plate for 5 seconds. Alright, so here's the toothpaste, and then here's a picture of a satellite dish, and then that's it. Right? So they see that. Whereas the experimental group saw a picture of the toothpaste followed by viewing a mountain waterfall for 5 seconds, with the idea being that the waterfall would produce positive emotions of cleanliness, freshness, coolness, those kinds of things. The question is, what impact did this have? Well, they asked participants then to rate this brand L toothpaste and their likelihood to purchase it. And we can see the control group, after one trial, one exposure of Brandel followed by a satellite dish, their rating was at 50. They're just like, meh. But the experimental group, the ones that saw Brandel followed by the mountain waterfall, one time are already rating it as more positive. After repeated pairings of these kinds of things, so we look across these pairings now, we see that the experimental group, after repeatedly seeing Brandel followed by waterfalls and pictures like that, that their positive rating of Brandel toothpaste continue to go up. Keep in mind, they've never tasted it. They've only seen pictures of a tube of toothpaste and pictures of mountain waterfalls. And yet, after 20 times of seeing this, they're rating it very positively. Whereas the control group continues to rate the Brandel toothpaste as meh, right in the middle. So, that's the power of Pavlovian conditioning in advertising. With sufficient pairings, the brand can produce positive emotions and can even affect preference tests, taste tests. So think about the number of times that we see commercials. Every time we watch a commercial, that's product being paired at us, right? Attempting to change the way we feel about a product, and because depending on how we feel about a product will make us more or less likely to approach that product in a store and purchase it. Politics. In particular, campaigns. Campaigns are really just a special type of advertising, right? But we tend to think about them as people voting for their interests, right? How do we choose to vote for a candidate? Well, we think about, we reason through it, we might study about it, about what their stances are, right? There are those that say we vote with our wallets, or that we vote based on our values, and so we try to find a candidate that shares our values. As it turns out, really the best predictor for who we'll vote for is how we feel about that candidate. People vote with their guts, with their emotions. We can predict who people will vote for based upon their emotional reactions to the candidate, not on whether the candidate is actually going to do something for them, right? So people will vote for a candidate that's not at all in their best interest as long as they feel good about that person. And that's where the campaign advertisements come in. So here are a couple, just two political advertisements. These are from a previous election cycle, the 2012. But I invite you to watch each of the clips, and as you do that, look at the pairings. What are the words, the people, the events, the music, right, that produce feelings, that produce emotions? What are the things that get paired in these clips? Because now that you're looking at it through a lens of Pavlovian conditioning, I suspect that you'll be able to see how that conditioning is being applied in these short commercials.
Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez tramples on basic human rights and silences critical media. He's also said, "If I was from the United States, I'd vote for Obama." Russia's Vladimir Putin supplies weapons to terrorists, supports Iran's nuclear ambitions, and calls President Obama an honest man who really wants to change much for them. Once called Obama the most progressive candidate to the U.S. presidency. Chavez, Putin, Castro, Obama secured the dictator vote. Does he have yours? Campaign for American Values PAC is responsible for the content.
I'm Mary Bono Mack, and I approve this message.
Thanksgiving is a wonderful holiday. Not for Raul Ruiz. For 6 years, Ruiz led protests attacking Thanksgiving and our American values. At one protest, filled with anti-American and pro-Palestinian agitators, a statement was read from cop killer Momia living a Holocaust. Another protest turned violent, and Ruiz was arrested. It's outrageous. Ruiz is running for Congress.
So let's summarize. Classical conditioning is involved in the treatment of phobias, establishing emotional responses to people, products, objects, ideas. It's even involved in our tolerance to drugs and in which candidate we'll vote for. These conditioning techniques are very powerful. And so when they're being applied, really one should look to ethical guidelines and think about how any ethical concerns that come up with the use of these techniques. Thank you.